So when I'm talking about internationalization, it's important to realize that there are various dimensions of that. We want to make sure that we have internationalization of student experience via transfers and exchanges and things of that kind, but also internationalization of employability, the possibility of people to move from a job in this country to a job abroad and then back and then somewhere else, and to develop all the kinds of skills that you need and that Jeff in particular alluded to in terms of his own personal experience. Internationalization of research, it's increasingly difficult to do individual-based research even in the traditional lone scholar disciplines, and increasingly important to be part of international communities. I was on a project that was funded by the European Science Foundation a while ago, and we had a meeting in Berlin, and the German delegate proposed that everybody should speak in some language that was not their native language. And then a Swedish woman stopped the conversation dead by speaking in Georgian. And then we reverted to speaking in whatever we felt was comfortable for us. But there was an interesting point behind the proposal. So mechanisms for achieving this degree of internationalization, well, obviously the possibility of exchange is a crucial one. But there's also the possibility of exchange in the sense of intellectual movement, even without physical movement, by the understanding of the way things can be different in different languages and different cultures. And that's something that's obviously facilitated by the existence of the huge resources which are available on the internet. When we launched the Languages Matters More and More document in February, I was invited to go to Millbank and sit in a studio and be interviewed by various people in regional radio stations, Newcastle, Warwick, Cambridge, and one or two other places. And almost everybody said, what's the point? Doesn't everybody speak English? So really, why bother? And of course the answer is that 75% of the world don't speak English. But perhaps more important than that, even if they did all speak English, that's still not a reason for us not to learn other people's languages, because otherwise you end up in the situation where everybody else in the room knows something and knows some other language and can do your thing, but you can't do anything else. And again, the example of the bilingual news cameraman is a good example. So to put it in the way we put it in that document, there is a serious risk that as the world becomes a world of polyglots, we remain a nation of monoglots. And interestingly, I've seen a paper recently that argued exactly the same problem from the perspective of the United States. When we talk about languages and exchanges and the ability to develop international links, it's important too to understand that this is something that can happen at all levels of the educational system, and that in that sense the problem of how we deal with languages is not just a problem for universities and academics and researchers and people who've started their career, but it's getting it started as soon as possible. So already the question of how languages are developed and used in the primary system, and to what extent are there possibilities of exchanges. I can remember my daughter in primary school sort of half falling in love at about the age of 8 with a German visiting lad who was very, very good at football. And I don't think there were many British lads going over and playing football in German primary schools, but perhaps there should be. Secondary levels, again, all kinds of schools, not just the schools that tend to promote languages. There are some figures that were reported in the paper this week about the number of people who take languages at A level in the private independent sector as opposed to the state sector. And since languages fall into the category of so-called difficult A-levels, which are considered to be the kinds of things that you need to get into prestigious research-intensive universities, the debate is one about avoiding a kind of sectarian division of society. Then there's the issue of how languages and internationalization is promoted in the undergraduate curriculum, and again, also the issue of whether that language is studied as the things that those individuals are studying, or whether it's languages as ways of developing wider horizons for social sciences, historians, and indeed engineers and natural scientists. It continues at postgraduate level because it's never too late to start developing a language skill, and never too late to discover that it's important that you do discover and that you do develop a language skill if you start being involved at postgraduate level in some kind of international research project, and even, as we've seen at the British Academy in funding our postdoctoral fellowships, even at that stage there's the possibility, and as we heard from Jeff earlier on, that can, even when you've got into academic maturity, then you can still discover the need to go and speak French or German or whatever it might be. Internationalization also relates to another sort of buzzword of the academic times, interdisciplinarity, because to develop groups and teams needs scientific, in all disciplines, science disciplines, social science disciplines, needs international collaboration. And again, even if the basic activities and the meetings are conducted in English, it won't be the case that all the kind of back scene stuff is done in English. So across the full range of disciplines, and social humanities, business studies, and so on, and one that I'll come back to in particular, the issue of area studies, which is a very important area. Some recent developments that sort of half give you hope. So the number of language students has shown a slight recent rise, but when you track it out, it turns out that it's not necessarily fueled by recruitment from the UK. So maybe the language programs are increasing, but it's because of enterprising decisions made by students from overseas, rather than solving the national problem. It's also extremely patchy across different languages, and that raises exactly the question that we've already heard about, which languages are the ones we should be promoting. And the issue in particular of so-called strategically important languages, which are not always the ones that students will select and pay for. And in that connection, absolutely agree with the point that Jeff was making about the need to disentangle problems. The British Academy was invited, or Hefty was invited in the letters that were sent out to the various funding bodies in December to engage in a conversation specifically with the Academy in order to ensure that strategically important disciplines didn't just mean trying to ensure greater recruitment for the scientific areas. And we've recently prepared a document which is just about to go to Hefty, and it will make exactly that distinction between the issues that rotate around modern European languages, the issues that rotate around world languages with very large populations, Mandarin, Arabic, Japanese, etc., but also issues that relate to the specifically important languages that have a temporary but urgent issue about them. We can add, to the examples we've already heard, we can add things like Pashto and Dari and so on. One area that doesn't figure enough in the discussion, I think, is the role of languages on the internet. There's a sort of monoglot assumption that the internet is always in English, but of course that's just because the internet that we tend to read is in English. People have estimated that within 20 years the majority of web pages, numerically speaking, will be in Chinese. A colleague of mine who does research on Japanese has figures that show that there are more blogs in Japanese than in English. I said that to a colleague, and he said, that can't be possible. And I said, well, how would you know? Do you read Japanese? Do you ever go anywhere near a Japanese website? And he said, well, no, it's true, I don't. But of course, the colleague who did knew that there were. If you look at the ranking of the languages of the world, not in terms of the size of the number of speakers, but in terms of the most used languages on the internet, then Korean, which doesn't get anywhere near the top ranking in terms of the size of the population, because basically it's Koreans that speak Korean and not a whole lot else apart from the growing community of Koreans in the United States. But in terms of it being a highly technologically literate and rich country, then it's the 10th most used language on the internet, but is actually, as far as I know, only taught in 2 UK universities. And a growing number, if you look at the Thomson indexes on publication and research counts and citation, a growing number of the world's top research papers are published in Chinese. And that raises an issue of whether Chinese would become the new lingua franca of science in due course, in the same way that we've seen an evolution through from the role of Latin as the intellectual lingua franca in the Middle Ages and Renaissance through to English in the modern world, or whether in terms of the very interesting recent book by Nick Ostler called The Last Lingua Franca, we're approaching a point at which there will really be a huge diversity of languages in the world, and no language with a particular preeminence, and certainly not English. And some piece of evidence for that is the increasing importance and increasing monetary value of web translation. I said I'd say something about language-based area studies, because this is an important area, and it's an area that got some kind of promotion in the sort of last funding round via the money that was dedicated by HEFKI to it and by the research councils, particularly the SRC. And it's important to underscore that this exactly has to be the language and the culture and the understanding of the regions and the history and the way societies develop, and therefore also, of course, the possibilities in terms of business development and international exchange. So it's not just a question of, which is sometimes what deans like to think, okay, just put a few more pounds into the language centre, buy a few more language courses, and you'll be there. We need the depth of understanding that goes with the language. We need to understand the issues around multilingualism and multiculturalism, and here I'd make a distinction again that's perhaps not made enough between two kinds of multilingualism. There's the kind of multilingualism which I guess we're mostly talking about here, is where you're trying to educate people into learning more languages than the language that they simply were born with. But there's also the issue of how you deal with a world in which many of the people are multilingual just from birth, because it's not possible to live in many societies without acquiring more than one language. And in some sense, although this doesn't always enter into the national discussion of it, the UK is exactly like that. I work in Manchester, and we have projects there looking at the so-called community schools and the extent to which, for example, there are not just the sort of longer, more established immigration cultures, but also more recent ones. The Polish communities now have schools and newspapers and so on. And understanding the nature of that, I think, is an important both aspect for knowing how our country and our system works, but also in terms of thinking how that language skill can be deployed and developed. Because there are actually many people in this country who are already very competent in languages, and there's evidence that if you've learned a couple, then just learning a couple more is easier, I would say. Simple, but easy. I just want to finish by mentioning the specific issue of the program in languages and quantitative skills, which the Academy was given specific funding for, a sum of 5 million over the period of the spending review, in recognition of the need to promote these kinds of agendas that I've been talking about. This is a quotation from the letter which we received, together with the indication of the money to be spent. Just to itemize, what we're trying to do is not spend this money just exclusively on more postdoctoral fellows or more interesting research projects, though of course there are some of those as well, but trying to develop partnerships both with bodies like the research councils and potentially other academic bodies, but also with businesses, cultural organizations, schools, and so on, introducing some kind of system of prizes that would help to get schools and language groups to be able to get some kind of public value and recognition for the work they do, developing conferences and workshops. We're talking at the moment with the British Association of Comparative Literature about the possibility of a conference on language and literature in translation and in writing literature in languages other than one's own, and also developing a series of inquiries and reports to document the situation and try and understand better what is required. Okay, so that's the range of things that I want to throw into the debate from the point of view of the Academy, so I'll stop there.